Why are you still interested in religion?
Vulgar curiosity.
Why do people become Moonies? Do they choose, or are they brainwashed? These and many other questions were investigated by Eileen Barker in a 7-year study of the Moonies. Her book, The Making of a Moonie, is seen as a classic, not only for its contribution to the sociological study of religion, but also for its exemplary research methods.
All about the making of a Moonie.
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 What an astonishing volume that was.
The making of Moonie will always stand as one of the primary books, both in New Religions and in sociology of religion itself.
I think in this sense, The Making of a Moonie will remain a methodological masterpiece.
In December 2023, a group of us, who now work for Inform, went to visit Professor Emerita Eileen Barker at her own home to learn more about her career and why she founded Inform 35 years ago. So what made you want to found Inform?
At a general level, I was getting worried because I was observing what seemed to me a lot of unnecessary suffering through the misinformation and ignorance of people about new religions. In the 70s, newspaper headlines continually about these dangerous brainwashing cults who were taking their children, adult children, away from their families and their careers, etc. And there was the growth of the industry of brainwashing, of deprogramming. The idea was that the child, this adult child, couldn't possibly choose to get married in a mass wedding or go dancing on the street shouting Hare Krishna or what have you. They must have been brainwashed to do that. There was no other explanation, which was why I did my PhD on the brainwashing issue. But these deprogrammers would do terrible things. They would lock up people who were kidnapped illegally and hold them until either they managed to escape or convince their captors that they had lost their faith. And very often they would go back afterwards, but not always, but quite often they were left in a pretty bad state. And the parents were suffering, and they were being told that they had to do this if they loved their children, paying thousands of pounds to these programmers. But the whole thing was, it was a really, it's very difficult to describe it now because it's no longer like this for a lot of reasons. But I talked fairly recently, a few months ago, to somebody who is a very well-known broadcaster, Channel 4. And he said that when he was a child, he was absolutely scared because about the Moonies. And it was the kind of thing in his family, if you're not good, the Moonies will get you. Now nobody's heard of the Moonies, or very few people have. But anyway, they were sort of top of they are terrible, wicked and frightening. And those of us who were studying the religions knew that this was rubbish. Not that they were perfect, and there was a lot of suffering and everything that was going on, but not in the way or to the extent that was being described in the papers and that the anti-cultists were spreading. I mean, they were generalizing the bad things from X and the bad things from Y and the bad things from Z, and putting them all together as though every single cult would do all these things, and they'd be brainwashed and never able to escape unless you hired a deprogrammer. And then I was at an anti-cult meeting on this particular occasion, And some former members were talking about their experiences. And one of them was a unificationist, there was a Rajneeshi, I think there was a Krishna and somebody else. There were 4 of them. And they gave what seemed to be fairly honest accounts of their time in the movement. And the audience, which consisted of largely relatives of people who were in the movements, started to say, well, you were brainwashed. And they said, no, we weren't brainwashed. We chose this. But after a while, we'd had enough and everything. And the audience got more and more angry. And then the person who'd organised it stood up and tried to pour all troubled waters and said, is there anything that you think would be really helpful for parents to know? And a woman got up and started screaming, we don't want to hear this, we don't want to hear this. And I've been sitting quietly taking notes in a corner, and I just sort of stopped and thought, they don't want to hear it. I was already almost persona non grata, but I had been allowed to sit in on this occasion because of my work, particularly the stuff on the brainwashing and the Moonies, which was just denied. And I was vilified in a whole lot of ways about this. But anyway, I then went to a pub with the person who had organised it and the ex-Moonie. And we were talking over what had happened, and I said, well, somebody ought to do something about this. And they said, well, so I picked up the gauntlet and spent a couple of years trying to see what could be done. I knew the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert Runcie, quite well, and he helped and introduced me to people. At the Home Office, I went and saw David Mellor, and he gave me some start-up funding. I got a sort of little working party together, which included the person who had organised the anti-cult meeting, who had switched sides from being an anti-cult to coming to help with Inform, the parent of a Moonie who had tried to deprogram him and was in Inform, but had read my book on brainwashing, and he was a parent. There were some other parents and representatives of the churches and things. And what we wanted to do was provide a sort of centre where people could come, the public, government, churches, if they wanted to know about a particular movement or about movements, could come to Inform, and we would tell them who to get in touch with. Because we would know internationally by then. I had a large number of connections with people who've been studying new religions. A few, very few in Britain, but internationally, America particularly. And so that was the general idea, that we would be a sort of place that could tell the media or who to get in touch with who had been doing work on particular movements. And so that was, we opened shop on the 1st of January 1988. It's changed a lot in form over the years because what it can offer has changed. What is needed has changed. Public perception has changed. And now it's nothing to do with me. It's just run by these terrible students I had who have been working with me on and off for over 20 years. But they're keeping it going in their own sweet way.
What do you think are the highlights of Inform's work? Like, what do you? Most pleased Inform's been there for.
I'm pleased because I think it contributed to providing information that just wasn't readily available. We did feel that we were in the middle, in a sense, that we weren't, in fact, apologists. We were just trying to describe what the world was like, and I think that was very important. Then right from the beginning, we started doing seminars. We did 2 a year on various different subjects related to new religions. So there was, new religions and health, new religions and crime or child abuse, new religions and money, new religions and the law, things like that. And at these seminars, we would invite academics who'd been studying it or professionals. I mean, we might have lawyers when we were talking about the law, or therapists when we were talking about counselling or something. Other professionals who had an interest. But we'd also invite members of the new religions and some of the anti-cultists or the parents. And some of the anti-cultists did agree to come and talk. Some of them didn't. But they were always invited. So we weren't trying to provide the right answer. We were trying to show that there were different perspectives, that it was possible to believe that this was the greatest thing since sliced bread, or the worst thing. But to try and listen to other people's perspectives and understand them. We were very strict about confidentiality. One court case, which actually we were working with one of the so-called anti-cultists in America. I happened to be in America and they were dealing with this case, and it rang a bell with me, and it turned out that the problem was being reported to us in England as well. And we told the police, and some of the people who were complaining gave evidence in the court case against their abusing guru. And then the police decided that they wanted to know the names of other people who talked to us. And we said no, because we wouldn't ever do that without their permission. And we had to actually go to court. Luckily we won, and the judge recognised that we wouldn't have got any information in the first place if we hadn't promised, and we wouldn't get any information in the future to be able to help the police if we weren't very careful about confidentiality. I'm quite proud of Inform. We haven't always been perfect, but I think taken as a whole, the world, or at least Britain, is a slightly better place, or at least not as bad a place. I prefer to say that we managed to get rid of some ignorance. We stop some unnecessary harms happening. I think it's the lack of the possibility of respect for other people, which is not to say that we should love everybody in a sort of gushy kind of way, but at least listen. I think that's the most important thing, that it worries me when people don't listen. And like that woman standing up at the meeting saying, we don't want to hear this. That's what gets me. They just want to stay in their own little world of hatred. And even if you have been hurt, and I knew the woman, she had been hurt when her husband had gone off with somebody else in the movement. But it's this blocking. That's what I find difficult. But on one occasion, I actually got to have quite good relations with quite a few of the chairmen of the chief anti-cult movement in Britain. Lord Rodney was chair at one point, and he had had his daughter deprogrammed from a particular new religion. And he was sort of always sort of saying things about me. Anyway, I got in touch with him and he invited me to have tea with him in the House of Lords, which was nice of him. And we were having tea and I said to him, what is it that I say that you disagree about? And he said, no, everything you say is right, but you muddy the waters. People need to know whether it's black or white. Quite a few people have accused me of muddying the waters because they want a clear answer. Now, I can understand in some situations it's very helpful to have a clear answer. It's helpful for people when they leave a new religious movement where they've been unhappy or they've been controlled or abused in some way and don't know what's happened, and then they're told you were in a cult. That's a sort of relief for a bit because it takes away blame from them, from the person who we're talking about, and puts it on the movement. I can understand how this works, and I can understand how muddying the waters must be frustrating. But I still think there is a place, and a very important place, for people who do muddy the waters insofar as they do say on the one hand or on the other hand. The media don't like that. They don't like sharp headlines. And one headline I had on one occasion, I think it was in the Guardians, she's no room for a view. And this was because they were pushing me to say something like, which is the worst leader of a cult you've ever come across? And I didn't answer because it's very difficult to answer questions like that, or they want to say, well, are there any good new religions? I mean, are there any good Catholics? Are there any bad Catholics? Yes. What are you talking about? Some people think that some of the religions are very bad and because they themselves are fundamentalist Christians, say, and they think that their child is going to go to hell because they believe in this guru or what have you. Other people won't mind that, but they'll be worried because they're not completing their college degree. All sorts of things like that. So you have to listen to what the problem is, and you have to understand that muddying the waters can be difficult for people at a certain stage. But to get back to your question, I think it is the insistence on everything being either black or white that I find most frustrating.
So I first, I can't say I first met Eileen, but I first really encountered Eileen in a meaningful way in probably the mid-1980s, so before she set up Inform. But it's a very striking memory I have of that first sort of occasion, because it definitely had quite a profound influence on my thinking at the time and subsequently, really. So it was at a meeting with anti-cult people. So it was a panel. We formed a panel and I was invited to join it. So I imagine it was set up either by Eileen or by Jim Beckford. And the two of them were on it, and they invited me because at that stage I was working on the Hare Krishna movement. So I'd done my PhD on Hindus in the UK, and one of the groups I looked at was the Hare Krishna movement. And I was publishing around about the same time that Jim published his book, Cult Controversies, and Eileen, just after Eileen published her Moonies book. It had a really profound effect on me because I was astonished at the capacity of Eileen and Jim to manage what I felt was a really difficult and tense occasion, when we were really being bombarded by criticisms from people in the various anti-cult movements and people who took that position anyway. And they were so calm. Eileen and Jim were so calm, and they had obviously been in that situation on many times before, and they knew how to adopt a stance of neutrality. So not advocating the position of minority religious groups, new religious movements, but not denying the voices of those people who had anxieties and concerns about people in so-called cult movements. And they were just able to handle those criticisms so well. The other thing that I wanted to say, obviously, about Eileen's significance, is simply the formation of Inform in 1988. And the fact, obviously, that we have, all of us, managed to keep Inform going, and that it continues to be what it, a great source of information for a very wide range of people, from journalists through students to people in government organizations and so on.
The figure of Eileen Barker in my world was that of the Dark Queen. And it came from, the formers who, or the older members of the anti-cult community, who saw her as a challenge to their point of view, that people were sometimes snapped in and then would snap out of cultic involvement. And the interesting thing in retrospect, as I think about, Eileen's approach and Eileen's studies, and those in the anti-cult world, is that there was so much that they could agree upon that they never had an opportunity to speak to. So and I think that Eileen was so much more balanced, and so I was immediately taken aback by her realness, her humanness, and her thoughtfulness when we first met at the conference in Philadelphia in '98. And it was at the recommendation of Michael Langoni and the then president, Herb Rosedale, who were trying to kind of broaden the scope of the International Cultic Studies Association, which at that time I think was called the American Family Foundation. And so Eileen was invited into this world. I could see that, her antennae were up, as they would be. I mean, the fact that she walked into this world, knowing that a lot of people were going to, be looking at her askew and thinking of her in a certain way. And as we sat down and communicated as one human to the next, we found out that, wow, there's a lot more in common than there is that keeps us apart. And I know that me saying that is going to rankle many of those who still in my community think of Eileen as a as someone to be questioned, of questionable ethic and moral, and I have no use for that. So we met at that conference. We had our first sit down, and it was just a lovely evening, over wine and cheese and crudité, and it was just really pleasant.
The funniest memory of Eileen, well, that's an interesting one, isn't it? I can remember Eileen's artwork. I think that's probably my funniest memory of Eileen. In years gone by, Eileen would nearly always give the opening presentation at an Inform seminar, and her introductions, her overview for the subject of the day, that was always comprehensive, but presented in a very comprehensible way at the same time. Comprehensive, but comprehensible. But very often when she did those introductions, she would also include some artwork. I'm racking my brains a bit now, going back many years, but I think in the good old days, we probably still had overhead projectors and acetates, and Eileen would bring out a felt tip pen and she'd start drawing on the acetate as she went along. And the artwork she used was, I think, kind of stick figure art, more what you might associate with a child's art than a learned professor. So it was always fun to see Eileen illustrating her presentations in this way.
I first got involved with Eileen and Inform. It was in the pre-Inform days. I had been on the United Reformed Church's Other Faiths Committee, who was then looking into relationships with new religious movements. And that brought me in touch with Peter Clark at King's College in London. Peter died quite a while back, unfortunately, but Peter organized a number of seminars at King's, which Eileen, among other people, attended, and as indeed I did. And that was how I got to know Peter and Eileen and a few others. And I remember my first encounter, I was a bit in awe of people like Ninian Smart and Eileen, I've got to admit. And they were going to go off for lunch, and I thought, well, it'd be a bit cheeky to join them. But Eileen said, why don't I come along too? So that was nice. And the relationships got started from there. That must have been around 1982, I think, or thereabouts. I think the most significant contribution is what Eileen says about it, namely that it's brought an assortment of different interest groups together. You've got academics, you've got clergy, you've got people that are involved in the counselling profession, and importantly, you've got the new religious movements themselves. And that was what FAIR didn't want. It didn't want to hear their side of the story. Their side of the story isn't always true, by the way, and I think it's important to put that on record. We don't just accept everything that we hear, but even if they do tell huge lies, which I don't think they do, even if one is critical of what they say, one still has to hear it and assess it. It's no good saying, well, we don't want to hear this. And that was Eileen's main objection to the approach that was taken at FAIR meetings. A number of people just didn't want to hear anything positive about new religions. And unfortunately, that idea is still around, that people don't want to hear certain things about NRMs.
Eileen had the courage to approach us in, I think it was 89 or 90. And she writes about it where she was apprehensive in coming to one of our conferences. But Herb Rosedale, who was president at the time, and like myself, was much more open to dialogue than some of the people, especially those that were most involved with the then Cult Awareness Network. We said, sure. So she came first with Gordon Melton and James Richardson, and Burke Rochford was also speaking at that. We had invited him to speak at the conference because he had written the first article on child abuse in Krishna. And we met privately during the conference. Then the next year, she came publicly, and she's presented at conferences. She's been a fixture at our conferences since. So I think what she was able to do was lower the temperature among most people, not all. There are always some diehards that hold on to their antipathy, and she enabled us to start talking in reality rather than in fantasies. So that was a very positive development that's continued and gotten better through the years. So, we don't hear the phrase pro-cultists so much anymore. You'll still see the anti-cult label in sociological literature. I've used the, critics and sympathizers, and even that is a phrase that distorts the reality some. But anyhow, that's how I met her.
At the beginning, just more through the infrequent kind of contacts we had when she came to the conferences, which was also, I think she even writes about it, and I think I would agree, very brave on her part, because it was like probably one of the first initiatives by someone who was seen as, by many people, pro kind of cult, to take the initiative to come to a conference, which was seen by many as anti-cult. Just to qualify, I don't like these labels at all because they're not very descriptive of who accurately is involved in these kind of issues. But over the time, we met at the meetings, and then I think one of the hallmarks of our connection was starting in 2009, these kind of what we call informal but formal kind of get-togethers with kind of what we call cult watching, cult research kind of organizations that started in 2009 with her initiative. And the first meeting being in London, where five organizations, four from Europe and our organization in Canada, came to meet around subjects of interest and topics. The first one being, I think it was, aging in new religious movements. And combined with that was a day where we would go and visit new religious movements, or quotation marks, cults, whatever you wanted to call them. And I think that was the beginning of a much more kind of closer relationship with Eileen and Inform that progressed continually. And we've been having these annual meetings ever since 2009. I think this year was our 2023, our 14th, if not 15th year. And we're planning already for our next one. I think these are kind of an initiative which is very important in terms of being able to exchange information and also get to know each other better. I mean, having phone calls or meeting at conferences are not the ideal occasion, since you're often, and in my case, since I'm one of the organizers of the international conferences, I tend to be on the run constantly. So it's very difficult to kind of have sit-down occasions where you can actually have in-depth conversations. And so these informal meetings that we've had, which led to informal get-togethers after the meetings, I think very productive in terms of getting to know one another better, as well as I had the opportunity and took the opportunity to come to, I think, a few events, Inform seminars that occurred, as well as I think there was a major kind of conference that Inform ran. In what year, I can't remember. And I always enjoyed those as well, not just because we went to Shakespeare after and had a few beers, but there was the opportunities to really kind of sit down, get to know each other, and exchange, not just with Eileen, but with others like yourself, Sarah, who's doing this interview, Suzanne as well, and others that worked at Inform, an opportunity to exchange on the subject, get to know each other better, where we're coming from, what our concerns were. And I think this was something that I think I'll always recall. If you talk about memories, I think the forming of these kind of get-togethers since 2009 have been very productive exchanges for all those involved.
Well, again, where there is Eileen, there is fun. And the same applies to Inform, but sort of let me pick up one moment. It takes me back exactly 30 years ago. Eileen was visiting Moscow, doing some research, and she stayed with my mom at my mom's flat for a few days. Eileen didn't speak Russian. My mom didn't speak a word of English, which worried me, of course, how they were going to communicate. So one evening I returned from work to discover Eileen and my mom engaged in a most, what shall I say, in the liveliest conversation, and obviously it was meaningful to both, because both gave me quite a sort of, rich account of what they have discovered. And part of it was something that I didn't want each of them to discover about me.
And then it was time for the healing. So then they come out with these plastic pots of water, and Eileen's sitting in a chair, and we're in like a living room area. There might have been tile on the floor, but there was no concern for what was going to happen next, and that was to say magic prayers. And I'm not sure if they were Russian Orthodox or not. It might have been Kyrie eleison. It was something along those lines. And then he started dumping water on Eileen, and Eileen was taking it. She was going along with the program. It was like, I thought, and her blouse was getting soaked, and we still had to drive to get back down to, Barcelona. So she was going to be sitting there in wet clothes unless they gave her an opportunity to change. But I think we left with her in her wet clothes and then stopped at a at a convenience in order for her to change up. But she was a good sport, but it was probably one of the funniest moments. And when he asked her, he said, "In 3 days, you will have no traces of any of your leg pain." And she said, "Well, I've had this for X number of years, and if you accomplish that, I'll be back and be one of your followers."
We organized a joint Inform Chesnur conference in London. We went to a medieval dinner, and we were given medieval capes. And again, Eileen started showing her prowess in medieval dancing. And of course, she also was quite fun in conducting mock ceremonies. More or less paralleling in a funny way those of new religious movements. And I remember in Tallinn, in Estonia, we were almost thrown out from a restaurant because the restaurant owner believes it was a real cult, possibly dangerous, and parodistic intent was not really easy to understand. When we had difficult problems in our personal life, I'm not talking of the academic life only, many of us, we went through grief, through divorces, and she was always there with a good word and good advice. And I believe it is extremely important to have a friend with not only an academic model, and the model, if you want, of academic policies and politics, but she's also an exceptionally empathic and compassionate human being with a very deep sense of what friendship is all about.
Prior to meeting Eileen, I think of Star Wars and the Borg and the Klingons, and I had this idea that Eileen was the head of the Klingons. She was from the Evil Empire. Then when she was in Philly, I think it was 2004 or 2005, she was at a conference. There was a family who had a daughter who was involved in a group led by Mohan Singh. And I remember she came over to my house and she was hanging out, and I asked her if she ever heard of him. She called in for him. And the next morning there was all this research on Mohan Singh. And she said, "Come to bring the family to London, and we'll meet with other people who have been in the group, and we'll meet with the police. And if you tell me that you think that this is accurate, then I will testify." And so this relationship developed from being a member of the Klingons to being someone who I counted on for very important things. Eileen asked myself and Joe Kelly to go with her to visit a number of different groups that she was interested in researching. And I remember her giving me very clear instructions on what to do, how I was to behave, but she wanted our opinion. And in this particular situation, there was a man who was a healer, and she was being healed. And we were there probably most of the day. And it came time that he was going to do this healing on her. And she was wearing a kind of clothing that if it got wet, you could quite see through it. And he was throwing water and oil all over her and rubbing her. And she gave me this look like, if you laugh, I will, because and I just went like the most flat affect I could. And it went on and on and on. And it was funny to me to see Eileen going into that mode of a researcher, not being prejudicial, open, and also I don't know that I would let somebody be putting oil all over me that I could basically be see-through, but that's what she did. And for me, I mean, there's many things. My initiation in being into the Neti cult that she created. We had some interesting experiences, but I think seeing Eileen in this healer's office covered in water and oil, and her looking at me with that look like, do not crack a smile, was one of the best.
One time, Eileen and I were sharing a hotel room at the SSR conference. I don't recall the year. She received a telephone call from sociologist friends who asked if she had a bottle of liquor. And I don't remember what kind of liquor it was, but she did have a bottle. I decided to tag along while Eileen went to meet James Beckford, Jim Richardson, and David Bromley. And before she left our room, she bent over and pulled her jacket over her head, and she walked down the hallway, listing sideways in a very strange gait. And I'm following along, laughing my head off and hoping that no one will see us, right? And but no one was in the hall, and we got to the elevator and pressed the button, and I'm standing there hoping no one's in the elevator. No one was. Then we got in the elevator laughing, and when we got off the elevator, she hunched over again and walked to their room, and I was laughing as I was following her, and amazingly we met no one in the hallway.
And why was she doing that? Just to make you laugh?
I guess so. There was no reason. There was no rhyme or reason.
That's so funny. Oh, really nice.
I think probably my fondest and some of the more humorous ones grew out of Eileen's development of the cult of Nessie. This really kind of developed at that early Cesner meeting at in Cesner, which was right on Lake Como in Italy, and several of us became among the original members of the cult of Nessie. I still have a picture that was taken at Eileen's home, actually, shortly thereafter, that I turned into a calendar picture. And
I thought, I didn't know her very well. I was a bit in awe, and I thought English. Well, I used to live in England, actually. I went to school. I went to St. Francis School for Girls. So I lived there as a teenager. But I had the impression that, university professors would be very snooty and snobbish. And I was surprised because she was very warm and open, and she was funny. She was telling jokes. She sort of put her head on my shoulder and said, "Oh, I'm so tired." And so I just felt she was, truly, well, I guess the Yiddish word, she was a mensch, she was a real person, you could talk to her. One thing I really liked about her was I could phone her in the middle of the night. I'd always seem to forget what time it was, and I'd phone her at like 1 a.m. or something. And Peter was always so polite. And then she'd say, Susan, do you realize what time it is? But then she'd talk to me anyway. And I once phoned her when I was in a panic because the Raelians had just dumped me. And I'd been studying them for years. And because some journalist had quoted me in an article that they didn't like, they sent me this formal letter saying I would no longer be allowed to attend any meetings, and also that when the extraterrestrials arrived in their spaceships, I wouldn't be allowed to go in, things like that. So I was like really upset mostly because I wanted their cooperation in giving me photographs for my book that was coming out. So I was sort of telling her my, anxieties, and she said, Susan, you're a sociologist. For sociologists, everything is data. The fact that the aliens have dumped you is something interesting you can write about and analyze. And I went, oh. And so she was always putting me in my place, as a sociologist, like what your stance should be. And I really appreciated that. Well, once I was just staying up with her late in a hotel room, and we were drinking wine and eating snacks, and there were some other grad students there. And she started to, she's a trained actress. You always have to remember that. So she's very good at imitating people. So she decided to pretend she was a cult leader sort of therapist. So she was telling people to sit in front of her, and she would look them in the eyes, and she'd say, now just breathe. And then she would start telling them who they were. And it was really funny because we all knew it was a joke, but the young grad students were sort of, they were almost taking it seriously. So I've seen her do things like that. She can be really, really amusing.
And so there are many groups, a handful, that because of Eileen's introducing me to their leadership, that have been very helpful in facilitating if somebody has mental health issues in that group, facilitates them going into therapy, and brings about the change that she wants. So there was one family whose years ago, they had attempted to kidnap the programming of their child out of a group that is very large and well known. And that child had disconnected from the parents for years. And conference after conference that I attended, the parents would come to me and say, do you think you could do anything to get us to be able to communicate with our child? Or we have grandchildren that we've never seen. And I would always say, I think there is a way, but you might not like that way. And everyone else is going to tell you that this is crazy. But I think that Eileen maybe could facilitate that. Your child is never going to leave that, or they maybe leave, but there's nothing that I could do to encourage your child to leave the situation. This is their life. They raise their kids, and this is where they are. You did something that traumatized them. This is the programming, and but I think this could she could bring this change about. So year after year after year, and finally they agreed. And Eileen did facilitate that family meeting their grandkids. And for me, that's an amazing thing, because in a sort of related to Amanda's research, the idea that these children who are in a closed system could meet somebody that was nowhere in that closed system, and if they chose to leave, they would have somebody on the outside. They would have a beachhead, and that I think affected me tremendously.
I believe that Eileen has encouraged members of new religious movements to end or alter, to revise questionable or harmful practices. So I think she's done a lot behind the scenes. I know from firsthand observation that Eileen is an excellent teacher, as she has mentored many young scholars. And as we know, the importance of Eileen's work was acknowledged in 2000 when she was made an officer of the Order of the British Empire.
Well, Eileen and I have developed a close relationship over the years, and not just her scholarship, but her personality. She's has a very calm and presentable demeanor. She enjoys things, she gets angry, but when she's doing her scholarship, these are kind of pushed aside, and the task becomes important, and accomplishing the task in the right way becomes important. That is a constant reminder to the rest of us.
I don't know. I guess looking forward, I hope that there is an active attempt to continue what Eileen started in terms of the dialogue among those who are more academically inclined, studying groups, and those who are working with the casualties and the casualties themselves. Unless there's a concerted effort to keep that dialogue up, it will die a natural death because people don't have a natural motivation to go to the other side.
She's put herself out there, and so almost in a sense what you do is you're like a lightning rod which attracts reactions from different perspectives and different points of view. So what happens is that you're going to be disliked by those who are saying, why are you reaching out to, in quotation marks, which comes up, the enemy, as well as those who are going to react and say, how can you deal with someone like that who is on the opposite side? So you get critiqued. I think you get, rarely do you get kind of the accolades for reaching out and doing something, which is a major step, and you tend to become a lightning rod for all the problems and confrontations and criticisms. But I think in the long run, if you really want to look at it, and people who have different points of view, this is a major step, and I think an important step, because your goal is to understand more and be able to help people around this issue, which is very controversial. Dialogue is what is needed. Dialogue does not mean you believe and go along with somebody. Dialogue means you're open to listening and maybe changing how you view things, or maybe learning more. And I think that is a major kind of goal that we should all have. And I think that was a major kind of achievement on the part of Eileen.
Well, I believe she basically invented the field of new religious movements.
Obviously, we're always trying to diversify our sources of funding. As I know how hard Suzanne, as honorary director, works on that. I mean, it's a massive work, the amount of work that she does. And we're very, very grateful, obviously, to continued support from a particular government department for the kind of project work that we've been able to do. But for a range of smaller charitable organisations and so on, who still find value in the work that Inform does. And then obviously there's also our kind of current partnerships. So who do we work with? Whether the Religion and Media Centre, for example, so who can we work with and how can we work with them so that we're not in competition with them, but we're all gaining mutually from that work. I think, there are multiple examples of that, but those are just some of the things that obviously we're doing to think ahead for Inform and to make it as important in the next 35 years as it has been in the previous 35 years.
Well, I hope Inform will continue because it's a very, very valuable institution.
Congratulations to Inform and Eileen for 35 very productive years, and best wishes to all of you for another long 35 years or more.